one of the things that comes out loud and clear when you study Brazil closely is that in various areas, legislative, judicial, regulatory, there's just a proliferation and an excess of procedures to get everything done. I think looking at the regulatory agencies, there are clearly some very strong procedures put in place, but we have a situation in which in Brazil, every M&A is assessed by 3 different agencies, which is a disincentive to investment in the UK and the US and Europe. The regulatory agencies come down very hard if an M&A looks like it might be a threat to competition, but doesn't get involved in small ones, like Cade is very bogged down in looking at things that are really too small for it to be bothered with, and thus that slows everything down. I think that the issue of how to improve the functioning of the courts is something that, of course, Brazil isn't the only country in Latin America to be really struggling with this, but it seems encouraging that one of the papers was looking at the case of Rio de Janeiro and the efforts that have been made there, how impactful they have been. So one of the key things has been to computerize all the backlog of cases in order to start clearing that backlog. There's been some leadership there also to develop what are called mobile courts, which are taking courts into poorer areas, essentially trying to resolve trivial, smaller cases before they get to the courts and bog down the system as a whole. Now, I don't know what that is, if that's a peculiarly strong leadership in Rio de Janeiro, if it's an issue of funds and political backing, financial backing, but the fact is it does show that this can be addressed if minds are set to it. So the question of political reform then, we're back to issues that have been on the agenda for a long time, which is how do you address the problem of the proliferation of small parties, which is quite a serious problem, not just in terms of how it slows down legislative business, but when you combine that with Brazil's prevalent weak party discipline, it means you've got very hard to manage coalitions, slow legislative processes, and also it opens, how do you manage these coalitions? It opens the way to opaqueness and, well, corruption, effectively. For a poor country, well, it's not a poor country, it's a middle-income country, but the amount that's spent on elections is very outsized for Brazil. And if we're thinking about how to improve the functioning of the political system and the accountability of parties and their representatives in Congress, one suggestion is that the idea of district voting should be put back on the table and that there should be some kind of commission to look at that, because that would tighten the link between the electorate and their representative in Congress. They would choose a representative. Now, obviously, at the moment, the parties don't feel it's in their interest. Party leaderships want to have the control of who is in Congress. But also, you know, one of the issues that remains unaddressed and has been a contributing factor to the proliferation of small parties is those regional imbalances where you have an overrepresentation of less populated, poorer states relative to the South. So in terms of, these are just some of the ideas that are detailed more in the report about individual discrete steps that could be addressed and in many cases have been on the agenda for some time. So this isn't a question of, in some cases, necessarily identifying earth-shattering new things to be done, but really underscoring, and I'm going to move on to how this could help foment stronger and more sustainable economic growth at a higher productivity level. So, as I was saying earlier, the growth over that lovely period, 2004-2008, was very impressive by Brazil's historical average. 5% average annual growth compares to the previous 20 years average of about, I think it was about 1.9%. Okay, so on one hand, that was because Brazil was coming from low base, given the stagnation of the previous 20 years. But it was also, let's remember, these were extraordinarily favourable external circumstances. It would have been difficult for a commodity-producing country selling a lot to Asia not to have grown relatively well during that period. And also rebound factors, and one of the most exciting developments is this idea that finally Brazil is developing a sustainable internal dynamic, a growth of the middle class. A lot of that is to do with the stabilization of macroeconomic variables, means that household incomes aren't being eroded by very high inflation. But also a lot of the very strong income growth that we had over the past 5 years was also a factor of how decimated real wages had been in the previous 20 years. Nonetheless, we do have this powerful stability dividend, but one of the title of this is partly about beyond stability and growth, because that isn't going, if we just are content with that, then what we're going to do is squander the demographic opportunities that Brazil is offering at the moment. One of the bullets here, education sector improvements have led to improved labour productivity. That is true from the data in the sense that a key number to take away is that workers between the age of 50 and 60 average 6.3 years of formal education, whereas workers between 20 and 24 average 9.4 years of formal education, so 50% more. So that's great. This is this great pool of opportunity in the younger part of the labour force. But I think what's striking when you look at some of the data is how much the economy, for some of these issues that we've started to identify, has struggled to absorb these better educated workers. And in fact, in some cases, in many cases, unemployment is higher among the younger, better educated. You're starting to get this two-tier labour force that we actually have seen, and we need to learn the lessons from in Western Europe, where you have relatively rigid labour markets. And that's all fine and dandy in a recession, because it's meant that the social safety net has provided, and unemployment benefits have provided a stabilising factor. But in practice, what it means for the younger generation is they are shut out of formal sector jobs. You've got a two-tier labour force in which the younger entrants into the labour market cannot get permanent contracts. That's going to raise some serious questions, I think, in Western Europe in terms of intergenerational relations and tensions going forward. And Brazil starts off as being a society with many more social problems than much of Western Europe. So I think, we don't want to be making the same mistakes as Western Europe. So what I wanted to touch on here is that the key reason for the inability or the struggle that the economy has had in absorbing some of this improved quality labour force is the constraints facing the private sector in developing high quality jobs. So this history of balance of payments crises, I think, is still something that is still having an impact on Brazil in terms of the availability of investment finance. The repeated crises inhibited the development of long-term investment finance, and most companies of small and medium size still find it very difficult to attract that kind of finance. An interesting point, when people talk about, people always qualify for me, Brazilian economists, you shouldn't think about the Selic rate being indicative of interest rates. In Brazil, don't forget that BNDES has a subsidized long-term interest rate. But I think it's interesting to think about how in most economies where the middle class is developing, most employment is created by small and medium-sized economies. And innovation typically comes from smaller and medium-sized economies. Most of those subsidized investment lines that you get from BNDES they're mainly directed towards physical expansion. Very little of that funding is available for investment in R&D, innovation, software. And what does that mean typically? That means that typically those kind of investments are only made by companies with strong cash flow. So that tends to be something that it makes things more difficult for smaller and medium-sized economies.